Welcome all, and thanks for coming. This is an installment of the 2026 Spring Seminar Series presentations hosted by the SNF Center for Hellenic Studies at SFU. My name is David Mirhadi, and I'm a professor in the Department of Global Humanities, and I'll be moderating this talk. It otherwise would be completely radical. I'm pleased today to present today's speaker, Dr. John Daukas, the 2025-2026 Hellenism's Past and Present Local and Global Postdoctoral Fellow with the SNF Center. Dr. Daukas is, despite his youthful appearance, an ancient historian. His work broadly centers on imperialism, the ancient economy, and questions of identity in the ancient Mediterranean. And his current research focuses on ancient Greek imperialism through the lenses of the ancient economy, especially trade, wealth distribution, and access to resources, the construction and maintenance of ethnic, political, and interstate communities. His book project, Plotting Empire, the Klerarchy, and the Development of Imperialism in the Greek World, traces the development of the Klerarchy, which was an Athenian colonial institution through which the state parceled out plots of new territory to its citizens, and the Klerarchy's role in the development of the notion of imperialism in the Greek world from the Archaic period, so 6th century BCE, to the Hellenistic period, 2nd century, so 400 years. Don't drop your pencil. Building on his interests in numismatics, the study of money and currency, his second project will examine the long history of the war indemnity, the act of imposing war-related debt on defeated states, in the development of imperialism and its place within the larger histories of finance, debt, and diplomatic relations between Mediterranean states. I hope you all enjoy today's presentation by Dr. Daukas. John, note the red tie for Valentine's Day.
I came dressed and prepared. Thank you so much, Professor. I wanted to really quickly thank the Stavros Niarchos Center for having me. It's been lovely being a postdoc here. I have a fantastic cohort of all different sorts of scholars, and teaching has been lovely too. But we're not here to talk about that. Instead, we're here to talk about forests of empire, timber production, and the conquest of Eion. So in 476-5, the Athenians, just a few years after their sacking of the city of Athens, as well as the major but very close victory at Salamis, attacked Eion, a small city-state. Here's Athens here, really to the Northern Aegean. This is a bit strange. Athens had created a league of different other Greek city-states called the Delian League, which we'll talk about later. They had sworn to seek vengeance on the Persians, as well as to continue to prosecute the war. Many of these senior states over here on the western coast of Asia Minor, that Athens' first major move would be to conquer Eion, a relatively small city-state, all the way out in the north, is a bit weird and has perplexed a lot of scholars. I've given you the most thorough account in your handout 1. This is Plutarch, but you'll notice that Herodotus, Thucydides, and Pausanias also have much to say about it. So in this talk, I will be explaining why exactly it is that the Athenians attacked and conquered Eion. Following some really important scholarship, which we'll talk about in a minute, I argue that natural resources, and especially timber products, was one of the major reasons why Eion was targeted beyond its connection to the Persians. So a quick overview here. I'm going to quickly give you an introduction, historiography, and sources, as well as a short historical background to orient everyone. I know some of you know this period very well, and others of you perhaps less so. Then I'm going to divide the talk into 3 specific parts. The first one is about state needs. This is going to be all about the fleet and trireme warfare and its connection to the need for timber. This is something that many, many scholars have talked about for a long time. So I'm going to kind of bounce quickly through as much of that as I can into part 2, local needs, building materials and local goods, as well as the energy economy in Athens. I think I have a lot more contributions to scholarship in part 2, which is why I'm hoping to get there quick. And then part 3, labor needs, slavery and expertise. This is something that very few scholars have talked about. So I'm sort of aiming towards the end. Hopefully this talk will become more and more exciting as we go. Okay, but first let's do the beginning. So as I mentioned before, in many ways, I'm standing on the shoulders of academic giants. Perhaps the most important book on this topic is Russell Megg's Trees and Timber in the Ancient Mediterranean, 1982, and still a pretty good text. Another really important scholar, an Italian scholar, Eugene Borza, who's written, I've given you the Shadow of Olympus 1990 book. He also wrote a really critical article in 1987 about the timber trade. And then, of course, Vincent Gabrielson's 1994, very classical text on the trireme and how the trireme was financed. Really important to what we will be talking about today. I could give you many, many others. Please take a look at the bibliography. I've stacked it for you. Okay. I do want to also talk about a really important primary source, which you'll see referenced over and over again, Theophrastus of Eresus. He is a follower of Aristotle, so the Peripatetic school. The text we'll be referencing here is Periphyton Historia, so inquiry into plants is what we're talking about. This is a 17th century facsimile of the front. It's a very important text that survives all the way through, not just through the ancient period, but through the medieval and even into, as you can see, the modern period. There are 3 kind of major issues with this text, especially because of the amount of detail that it gives us that should give us some pause. So first of all, temporal issues. This text was written in the 4th century, at least a full 100 years after the conquest of Eion. So a lot has happened in that period. I also want to point out the problem of, I call it the philosopher problem. Philosophers famously have lots of great ideas, but frequently don't have a great grasp of what's going on the ground level. So essentialism, the notion of the Platonic ideal of the forms, and armchair philosophy means that a lot of philosophers are kind of famous for sitting down and theorizing about things as opposed to going out and actually seeing what's going on. I'm going to suggest that Theophrastus is actually a really great source. And you can see on your handout too precisely why this is. He, like Aristotle and some other philosophers, natural philosophers too, is going down and talking to the experts, the hulatomoi. These are the lumberjacks. So he's actually engaging and talking with experts on these points. We'll see later that I think we can corroborate a lot of his information with other sources too. Okay, so a really quick run through of the historical background. There are 3 major periods, developments that we all need to know before we move on. So the one hand, Athens has already had some involvement in this area previously with their imperial interests. In the mid-6th century, there's an autocratic tyrant who takes over at Athens. His name is Pisistratus. We call this period and him and his sons who reign in Athens the Pisistratids, okay? So Pisistratus actually comes up around here, takes a little bit of time to found a colony called Rakalos. I've given you references in the handout for you. And he acquires revenues by which he uses to reconquer Athens and support his tyranny. So the Athenians know exactly what's up here and what they can get, right? Miltiades, he's a very famous Athenian general. He's the one who fights the Battle of Marathon. Miltiades is sort of a crony of Pisistratus, and he spends some time up here, the Thracian Chersonesus. Once the Pisistratids are ejected from Athens, Miltiades gifts this, he conquers Lemnos and gifts it to the Athenians too. So we're seeing essentially a real heavy investment in this area when it comes to conquest. So that's the first part. The second question here is the Greco-Persian War. So I had already told you Xerxes' invasion. The Persians come in, attack, sack Athens. If Thucydides is right, they burn it to the ground or pretty close to it. And then, of course, we have the Battle of Salamis, which we'll talk about in just a minute why that's so important. Triremes. But that's the major second part. And then, of course, the Delian Lake and anti-Persian campaigns. So once the Athenians are successful in driving out the Persians. There's a little debate about what exactly they'll do. And they settle on creating a league with a bunch of other city-states. I'd mentioned this already. This is critical because of the finance associations connected with it, which we will talk about in connection with the ships. So let's get right on to part one, state needs, the fleet and trireme warfare. Okay, so the major question here is about the trireme. As Horton and Purcell have told us, longue durée history of the Mediterranean means that in the beginning and really throughout the period, we have micro-regions, small micro-regions that sort of surround the Mediterranean. This matters because while some areas can produce grain really well, they don't have silver, they don't have metals, they don't have timber, so on and so forth. So what that means is you really kind of need to trade with other cities, with other areas. Trade over land is very expensive. So you need boats, right? You need timber to build those boats. You really probably need a military navy too, because those boats are going to be sitting ducks unless you've got something to defend them. Thucydides talks about piracy, actually. So essentially what happens is we have the advent of the pentaconter, 50 rower ships. These are sort of the earliest predecessors to the triremes. At some point in the 6th century, someone figures out a new design. This is the Olympias reconstruction of the trireme, mid-80s, I believe. The trireme is 4 to 6 times more expensive to build, to man, and to source. So this also is far more powerful than the pentaconter. This is an aircraft carrier. This is high-tech, state-of-the-art stuff. A small fleet of these can obliterate pentaconters. So you can imagine right in the middle of the 6th century, everyone is sort of flipping out because they need to get triremes in order to maintain those trading routes so that they can bring grain in and eat and so on and so forth. So that's the pressure we're talking about here. Athens, it takes a little while for Athens to get into this. Von Weiss 2013 has suggested that during the Pisistratid tyranny, this is the son of Pisistratus, he reorganized the financial system at Athens in order to accommodate fewer ships, but these much more expensive triremes. The term is vinacrarii. Whether he's right or not, we know that Athens has triremes at this time, okay, of some sort. We have reference to them. Later on, there's a war with Aegina, and Athens picks up another 20 triremes. By the time they're staring down the barrel of the Persian invasion, they have something like 70 at most, at most. Then Themistocles comes in, a very famous Athenian statesman who essentially says, we should really consider building ships. At this point in time in 483, there was a huge influx. They found a bunch of silver. And Themistocles convinces Athenians to build 200 triremes. Remember how I told you how expensive and burdensome they are? Well, let's just quadruple the number. How is Athens going to pay for this? How are they going to maintain them? How are they going to man them? Themistocles is taking the big gamble. Let's figure it out after the Persians. After we defeat the Persians, we'll deal with it then. For now, let's focus on surviving. The gamble works very well, but now they're stuck with 200, maybe more than that, 200 triremes. References suggest that they can't even man these during the Battle of Salamis. So how are they going to pay for this stuff? Well, they try to do it through the dealing league, but it's not clear that the league can actually support this type of a ship. We see that Athens oftentimes doesn't touch those league funds. It's really unclear what exactly is going on. Even more importantly, sometimes it doesn't matter how much it is because these ships require very specialized types of timber. The way a trireme works is that you have a whole bunch of rowers, you have a beak, the front of the ship, and then you have a bronze sort of cap. And you row the ship real fast and ram into the side of another ship. Make a big hole, ship sinks. That means that you need a certain type of light, powerful wood. You need something that is very tall, because if you have composite planks, those moments, those areas where the planks come together is a weakness. You ram into something, your ship could splinter in half. This is really tough stuff to get, okay? You can actually see some of this design. You can imagine how this would have worked. Oops, sorry about that. So what type of material are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a latte. Okay, this is in your handout 4. Theophrastus has come for us, thank goodness, to tell us exactly what it is. Well, a latte is the best in your handout 4. Now, silver fir, in quotes, silver fir, a latte, fir, pauke, and Syrian cedar are generally speaking suitable for shipbuilding. Triremes and longships, on the one hand, are made of elate because of its lightness, while merchant ships are made of pauke because it does not decay. So we already see special types of timber for certain special types of ships. Okay, why do you not use pauke for triremes? It's apparently not as light. You want to have light, maneuverable ships so you can outmaneuver your enemy and sink them first. Some also make triremes out of pauke on account of their lack of elate. That's interesting. You can use these to build ships if you need it. But this is clearly a backup. This is something you don't want to do. And if you do it, you're hoping that you won't run into a fleet of elate built triremes because you might be out of luck, right? So if you look at your handout 5, we have this really great reference to how elate is used to build oars, as well as yard arms and masts. This is really important stuff. And it seems like oars, these 3, but especially oars, really can't be built from anything else. Note the elate is like an onion. That's a very unique reference. And then he goes on to point out that people who don't know how to deal with this right screw up the oars. You need to know exactly how to make oars from this type of wood. We'll get back to that in a minute. So rarity and price, if you look at our handout 6, he says, back to Theophrastus, there's just a very few areas where you can find this stuff. In Europe, it's really just Macedon, parts of Thrace. That's where Eion is, okay? And Italy. In areas, in Asia, Kylikia, Sinope, and Amisus, as well as Mysian Olympus and Mount Ida. Though notice here he says there's not much of that there. These areas, Asia Minor, these areas are under mostly Persian control at this point in time too. Probably not the best thing. So why not just source it with Macedon? We can see, and we'll take a look at a couple of references. Athens is already pretty close with Macedon. It's definitely getting wood from Macedon. So why does it need to go all the way up and conquer Eion for access to this material? Take a look at your handout 7, Perdiccas II. This is a Macedonian king, a little bit after the conquest of Eion. He makes it so that only Athenians can get Macedonian ores. So you can see the interaction. This is engaging with the market, right? The free market here. Well, the problem is simple. Macedon had been conquered and was a subject state under the Persians. There's a great passage in Herodotus where Alexander I, the king of Macedon, comes and tries to convince the Athenians before the Battle of Salamis to surrender to the Persians. Can the Macedonians be trusted? Maybe, but also maybe not. Several scholars have pointed out that Macedon is one of the most unstable kingdoms in the Aegean. Every time a new king shows up, there's a new succession. They have to have debates. There's frequently civil wars over there. Do you want to rely on someone like that for your computer chips to fly your airplanes to, fight your enemies? No. You will rely on them if you have the time, but you don't want to. So really what we're looking at is an attempt to acquire these resources. Okay, note 2, and we'll get back to this, a question of arboreal economy. If you look back at your handout 6, I have this great reference from Horton and Purcell. They say that timber of this size, remember timber has to be long and big, is to all intents and purposes an unrenewable resource. So it's very rare, right? You can't just go and find any type of elate. It has to be elate that is really tall. See these guys? Here's an example. Really tall. So in reality, once you cut this stuff down, you can plant it, but it's going to take 100 years, before you can grow it again. Handout 8, Millet, a economic historian, says a really interesting thing here. In this confrontation of a scarce natural resource by insistent external demand, ancient Macedonia might resemble the modern Middle East with its oil reserves so desperately sought after by the industrial West. So you can think of Macedon is sort of like a state that's constantly being pulled in many different directions. Everybody wants a piece of this stuff because it's clear that they have the best. And we'll talk about this question of an arboreal economy later, but I've been kind of dancing around the question of what is elate, or at least one of you pointed out already. I leave this essentially untranslated in my passages. Why is that? Because we don't really know. So on the left here is, these are 19th century botanists trying to categorize things. If I showed you these two, can you even see the difference? I mean, maybe a little bit, but they look pretty similar, right? This is Abies cephalonica, so this is probably the pit nuance that you saw. This is Abies alba right here, but they're pretty hard to tell. And, you know, if you look at some of our passages, so go ahead and go back to handout 4th, what Theophrastus tells us about the people of Cyprus is they use Aleppopine pit nuance because their island provides this, so back to they don't have elate. And it seems to be superior to the pelka. So what that means is that we can't assume that Theophrastus or indeed the woodcutters have this idea of species in the way that we do. That's Carolus Linnaeus. That's 19th century, right? That's not how they understand things. The environment is just as critical as the different types. And we don't really need to worry about this too much because, thank goodness, Herodotus gives us an offhanded account in which he points out that there are certain areas, a place called Myrkinos, which is very close to Eion, has, quote, abundant shipbuilding timber and much timber fit for oars. Elate is the one place that, the one type of material you can make oars out of. So this to me is a case perfect. This works perfectly fine. Several scholars, such as Karanthakis, 2019, he's in your bibliography, have made this concern about, oh, well, we don't see what many scholars have identified right here as elate. So this is Abies alba, the silver fir. It doesn't show up in areas other than really Macedon for Europe, but we don't really need to worry about that. So as I pointed out here, so this is Athens here, this is Eion. These are all the different areas where we see Abies alba, elate, modern currently. Eion is right here. Eion is right at the mouth of the Strumen River. Strumen River flows all out through this, kind of comes down over here and down and out. If you're Athens, you want to be right at the mouth because the way that you cut these trees down, you chop them down, you throw them in the river. It's called floating. You have to do it a certain way, so then it floats all the way down. This is where it all goes. The chopping is up here, a little further north. This is where all of this material goes. So this is the place you want to be, right? Have the locals cut it down for you if you can. And this is exactly why they do this. Okay, so let's go to hopefully the slightly more interesting bits now. Local needs, building materials, and local goods. So something that at least a few scholars have pointed out, but it doesn't seem like many people capitalize on, is the fact that Athens has to rebuild after the Persian sack. Eion is being seized maybe 4-ish years, roughly 4 years, after the Battle of Salamis. But remember, I told you the Persian general Mardonius had obliterated Athens, actually went and apparently burned down sides of the countryside too. So they need to rebuild, okay? Do they use timber? Of course they do. Most domestic houses are built out of timber. They use different types of timber for frames. I've given you an image here. Almost all the doors are made out of wood. This is from a sarcophagus, so this is an image of a door. Take a look at your handout 10. Thucydides tells us about how important and valuable this stuff is. When the Athenians are being forced later on in the Peloponnesian War to go and reside in Athens. Remember, Pericles gives this great speech. Thucydides tells us that when they were convinced, the Athenians began carrying out the country, their children, wives, their other household furniture, as well as the woodworking of their houses, which they took down. In fact, they do this all the time. There are lots of references of people fleeing their cities that are about to be attacked with doors on their backs, because that's what you need. You need this stuff, and it's very valuable. Let's not forget that the Persians certainly destroyed all the major public buildings. This stuff needs big, expensive timber, the sort of big, expensive timber that you would find in a place like Eion, right? So this makes perfect sense. There's also a question of deforestation and demand. So I'm happy to get into the questions at the end of the talk, but there's a huge debate about how much deforestation is going on in the ancient world broadly and in the Greek world and Athens in particular. I take the position that Alain Bresson has, which is there's actually a fair amount of deforestation, but it's very localized. So we can't expect there to be a lot of this sort of timber that's around. We absolutely have references to people, timber farms. There's surviving sources that talk about this, as well as if anybody's thinking of the Acarnanians, they're chopping down trees and making charcoal, right? But that really doesn't demonstrate much. Think about how desperate Athens needs grain, despite the fact that there are many, many farmers farming in Attica. They still need to import tons of grain. So why wouldn't this be the case for timber, which seems to be much rarer anyways? Okay, so if you take a look at your handout 11, this I think is a really interesting development. So Theophrastus gives us two bits here. The first one is that he says, while other words are serviceable for special articles belonging to various crafts, such as furniture, tools, and the like, elate is of use for almost more purposes than any other wood. He mentions using this super important, valuable, high-tech material to build all different sorts of things, to make things. In fact, he goes on to tell us, indeed, it is even used for writing tablets. These are the pinakes. When I first read this, I was like, wait, we use this for ships, right? Don't we need this for the triremes? I think what's going on here is this is right at the start of what we can think of as what I suggested as an arboreal economy. Imagine this. These logs are coming into Athens all the time. They're shipping this elate. It doesn't matter if it's coming from Eion or not. It's all coming into Athens because they need to build their triremes, right? They get these big hunks of wood. They need to refine them, shave them down, bend them, process them in whatever sort of way they are. 370 tons of this stuff is needed just for basic refitting of triremes every year. If 20 triremes go down in a sea battle, you need way more than that, right? But if that's what's going on in probably the Piraeus, think of all of the different pieces that are left over from this. Now, when I see this passage, I think pinakes, yeah, of course, because what do they have to do? They have to shave the wood down. That little bit right there, that's probably a pretty good pinake, and so on and so forth. Think about the reference to millet that I had mentioned in handout 8. It's just like oil in the 20th century. Imagine someone thinking 1,000 years from now, looking back and being, I wonder why they used oil for plastics all the time. Don't they need that for gasoline? Isn't this like the whole rush? Well, people realized they learned how to use different products in different ways out of these resources. Modern economists call this the oil economy. I'm calling this the arboreal economy. So when we see this, it actually makes perfect sense. This is a great, great opportunity to be bringing this stuff in and to be using it to build any number of different things. Okay, now on to fuel. So very few scholars have really worked on this because it's so difficult to nail down. So fuel is really important. What a surprise. Just like the modern world, we need fuel and energy for lots of things. So too did the ancients. They do a lot of things in order to mitigate this need for fuel because it turns out that if you look at the sources, we know that timber and any sorts of fuel resources are really, really, really expensive. Alain Bresson has done some really great work. I'm happy to talk about this in the questions. But the gist of it is that it was so expensive that most people couldn't be expected to keep their houses warm, that sort of a thing. So what is necessary? What do we need fuel for? Well, the obvious domestic one is cooking. People actually need this stuff to cook for sure. Also, we'll talk about manufacturing. Key here is silver and ceramics. I'll engage in that next slide. So we'll come back to this. But what type of wood are they using? Are they using raw wood? Well, for domestic cooking, probably. More than 90% of fuel sources in the ancient world is wood. There are some scholars have done some great stuff on other stuff, but it's not really important if we're talking about an energy economy, right? Minor in comparison. They're using probably a local supply, but we just talked about the deforestation problem, right? So how much of this is around? Are they having to drag this all the way down from the mountains? We have lots of evidence to suggest that Athenians are going all the way out to the borders between Athens and Boeotia and dragging huge, I guess, logs back to Athens. That's going to be expensive, right? Are you going to be able to pay for that to like cook your bread? I don't know. This is a really interesting question. So note the issue of transportation costs as well as perishability. Wood actually does go bad. If it gets wet, it'll melt, right? It'll disintegrate. You can only keep it for so long. And importantly, we're seeing an increasing population and economic activity. So it's not clear when this starts. Ben Ackrig has done some great work on this 2019. But what is clear is that there's a huge population boom that happens pretty quickly after the Greco-Persian Wars. He suggests something like a baby boom of sorts. So it's entirely plausible that this is something that's like a constant pressure, consistently boiling and cooking. Okay, so most major uses of timber is probably not cooking. Most of what we're seeing seems to be connected with manufacturing. Remember, I mentioned silver and ceramics. Silver is the most important. Go ahead and underline that and circle it. Athens becomes a major power because of the silver. Remember, I mentioned Themistocles and the building project. Without that find of silver, Athens may not have won the Greco-Persian War. Take a look at your handout 12. This is Aeschylus, the man who fought probably, certainly at Salamis, and he might have actually been part of the conquest of Eion personally. What does he say about silver? In his Persae, the Persian queen says, oh, are the Athenians wealthy or not? And the response to the chorus is, they have a fountain of silver, a treasure in their soil. This is like a nationalist icon because he's making the reference between the silver Athenians and the gold Persians. This is someone who participated in these events talking about this. I've given you some fantastic numbers. So between the 490s and 480s, this is between Marathon essentially and Salamis. Athens minted 4,000 talents. That's more than 100 million metric tons of silver. This is where their revenue is coming from. This might be more than the Delian League revenue that they're getting. You can take a look at Ellen Bresson about that. If they want to recover, this is what they do. They go right back to the mines and start mining again. We don't want to devalue other types too. Ceramics, Athens is famous for their ceramics. You've almost certainly seen their ceramic bowls. That's another major manufacturing center. We don't have as much information because it's really hard to tell how much is going on at any one time. I wish I could give you numbers like this. I just can't, but it's important. And there's, of course, other types of manufacturing going on. We have references for, building any number of different types of weapons, smelting. I can't tell you precisely, but this is really important. So all of this, you cannot use raw timber for. You need to use charcoal instead. It has to do with high heat. So both of these and certainly other manufacturing sources all use charcoal. Charcoal is really great because it's much lighter than normal wood. You're boiling out a lot of the water, right? It actually concentrates down the energy. So 1 unit of charcoal is worth 2 or 3, I think, times the amount of energy as a single unit, any given unit of wood. It's also much easier to transport, right? So you can see how much easier it is. It's going to be much lighter. Throw it in a basket. We'll deal with it later. The issue, though, is we don't know what the quotient of exchange is. So the process to turn wood into charcoal takes more energy than you get out. That means that if we're talking about huge tons of silver being smelted all the time, we actually need to know what the exchange rate is. Canophagus, the first person, 1980, who tackled this, used a 4-to-1 ratio, and he said, Athens has more than enough timber to take care of this, to do this every year. That 4-to-1 ratio, that is best possible circumstances. Most scholars wouldn't even look at this anymore. So Horner Purcell have suggested 10 to 1. A really great scholar, Tracy Rill, 9 to 1. That one looks a little better. But a fantastic scholar more recently, Veal, has she's doing work on charcoal now. She is the charcoal woman. She suggests it could be as high as 15 to 1. Well, if Athens has more than enough wood at a 4 to 1 ratio, and that's almost certainly wrong, now we have to totally rethink what the pressures of minting the silver is. And remember that this stuff is going to be taking away from use in other things like cooking. Athens desperately needs wood. I hope I've sold you on this point here. Now, even more interesting. So take a look at your handout 13. This is the Theophrastus. What does the Theophrastus say about charcoal? Different types of charcoal are used for different purposes. For some uses, men require it to be soft. Thus, on iron mines, they use that which is made of sweet chestnut, carua, euboikes, okay? When the iron has been already smelted, and in silver mines, they use charcoal of pine wood. And these kinds are also used by different crafts. Smiths require charcoal of fir rather than oak. So there's a preference to the specific type of wood that's used to make a specific type of charcoal. So we can't just assume Athens has brush or wood that it can use. They're using and needing something specific. Do they have a specific enough supply of that specific type of wood? I have no idea. No one seems to have tackled this at all, as far as I can tell in scholarship. What's even more interesting, when I first read this, I was like, this is Theophrastus doing his philosophy, right? This is the different categories. Well, some trees are slightly better than others. And here's our smoking gun. This is a lead letter that was written from an Athenian, likely weapons manufacturer, 4th century, so right around the same time as Theophrastus, okay? As you can see, it's extremely fragmentary, but what it essentially tells us is there is a guy who's trying to buy wood in Menda to take back down to Athens. Menda is in the Chalkidike, so that's pretty far away from Athens, but pretty close to Eion. He's looking for certain types, and this passage is really hard to understand. Zosima Archibald has pointed out that what this is very likely talking about is he's looking for certain types of wood. He's looking for certain types of wood to make certain types of weapons through the burning of charcoal. This proves Theophrastus. So this matters. This matters enough that there's a guy who's asking a business associate of his all the way out in Mende to take care of it or to run here. Okay, I think we're doing well for time, so just a little bit more. So now on to the labor needs section. I think this is really interesting. Really, as far as I can tell, only one scholar has seriously delved into this question, though there's been a lot of really interesting burgeoning interest in labor history in the ancient world, so there may be something I've missed. So great, they are looking for this special type of tree. They're looking for other types of tree and tree products, but the real question is who's going to do the work? It seems obvious. Well, you get woodcutters, right? Well, as I had already pointed out in your handout 5, you need a special type of woodcutter, because if you don't know that elate is like an onion, you ruin your ores. Even more interesting, how can you tell which trees look like elate and which aren't? You need an expert. You need a local. Where are they? You need an expert. You need a local. So in reality, labor is a major question. That's not even to consider the whole trireme construction. Remember, Athens went from maximum 70 triremes, probably less, to 200. They had to build that in less than 3 years. I don't know how they did it. This is a huge scholarly debate. But even after doing so, now they need 4 times the amount of specialists to not just replace these triremes. There's even positions where you need a ship carpenter. Each one of these triremes is supposed to have a ship carpenter who knows how to deal with this ship. I'm afraid to say Russell Meggs made the argument that you don't really need a specialist. You can kind of just teach someone how to do this. I think it's totally wrong. Most scholars haven't followed Meggs's point on this. Not to mention the question of rowers. I already told you in the Battle of Salamis, it looks like Athens didn't actually have enough rowers, and that was when literally everyone they could get, they crammed into those ships. They had fled Athens. So who's manning these things? It's a really great question. And who is going to take care of this now that we need to fight the Persians? So there are two ways of accessing this labor, right? There's the free market and the very much not free market. So the free market, we've seen this going on in Athens for at least a century. There's a reference to attracting foreign interest and manufacturing as far back as Solon, famously. This is the H-1B visa. Bring people in so that they can work. We'll have a special class of non-citizens called medics. These are the foreign people who live in Athens, who are foreign-born not citizens. And there's a whole system and structure of this. But I mean, this works just fine if you're not desperately trying to fight back a Persian invasion and need people now, right? You can try and find different people to attract, but it's not really satisfying. The one scholar I mentioned who has engaged in this question, her name is Henrietta Bissa, 2009. She did this amazing study where she looked at mostly late 5th and primarily 4th century sources, so later than our period, right? Even in the 4th century, more than 50% of the people who were building triremes in Athens were foreign born. This is a full century after Athens had created her great maritime empire. Athens is still relying on foreign expertise, even deep into the 4th century. I can't imagine that it would be any more different than the 5th, but I don't have the sources. I can't give you any clear window here. So this works just fine if you've got the time. But they really didn't. So instead, you need to go to the non-free labor market. We're talking about slaves. Hopefully that was obvious. We're talking about slaves. How do you get access to slaves? Well, you can go to a slave market, but are they going to have several hundred experts in trireme maintenance and building? I mean, no. They'll have a few. So really what you need to do is, I have a euphemism, direct acquisition here, but what I really mean is enslavement. Take a look at your handout 14. What Thucydides tells us happens at Eion is that the Athenians captured it by siege from the Medes and indrapodisen. This literally means to turn people into objects, to turn them into slaves. So this is a common thing that people will do all the time when they conquer a city. But I actually think that there's a real serious incentive to be looking for all these people who know how to do not just the building of the triremes, but the rowers, extraction and processing. This is where you get these people from. Remember that Eion is a city right on the shore. It's a port city. So if anybody knows and is doing manufacturing, it's at Eion that they're doing it. Okay. So I will hopefully sum up this, give you a bit of a conclusion. So hopefully I've convinced you that Eions conquest, at least in part, has a lot to do with the natural resources and especially timber. I've mentioned how important ships are, and I hope to add to the mounting amount of scholarly work on questions like construction and energy in particular, as well as labor. I've kind of touched on and off this question of the arboreal economy. This is kind of the type of thing I'm really interested. This is a future project. This question about how much this analogy between 19th century oil economy and 5th to perhaps 4th century arboreal economy, a term that sounds very sexy. I coined the term because I thought it really kind of captures this question of how important timber production, especially during this period, is. I don't really know if it stretches into the 5th century. I think I've made a pretty good case for the 4th century with the Ephrastus, as well as that lead letter in other sources too. So that's kind of like maybe gesturing towards future research. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'm happy to answer lots and lots of questions. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, that was terrific. There was no saving exciting stuff for the end. I found the whole presentation super exciting. So thank you very much. And I think it's wonderful that it's presented in British Columbia. I think that for most of the 20th century, you could say that British Columbia had an arboreal economy.
Yeah.
So I think it's very fitting that we're located here beside the Fraser River, where all these log booms have been floating along. Questions from others?
Yes, please.
Thank you very, very much. And spectacular talk. Could you talk a little bit more about deforestation and demand? If there are other sources that you've encountered that talk about this and maybe concerns already in terms of how much they have. The Athenians have to, as you mentioned, go beyond the Otia to look for log. So concerns about what happened in the lands with the production of log would outside of the reach.
Yeah, so there's a huge bibliography on this, at least in part because this is connected to what I hope is the now defunct sort of idea that this is part of the reason for the rise in Europe in the Middle Ages and in the later, I guess you call it the early modern period. And the idea there is Europe has a lot of trees, so they can continue to build ships and burn things and do all of that. Whereas in the Mediterranean, there's just not that many trees. And so this is one of the, again, this is one of the problematic arguments of why it is that civilizations in the Near East and in the Middle East are not able to keep up with Europe. So that's why there's I can give you books of bibliography. There's a huge debate. So Harris talks about this. I have him in the bibliography about how, we really need to stop thinking about this as a type of deforestation and much more about this is kind of how the Mediterranean is. He's actually pulling off of Horn and Purcell, who have a long, not too long, but a really great section on this. I think his name is Hobbs. Hughes is the gentleman. Hughes is, so I have him on here too. Hughes is really the big proponent for deforestation. There's a really great article, I want to say, by Peter Liddell that talks about the history of this argument. He makes a reference to Somnini, who's this person, I think in the 16th or 17th century. So this goes really far back. The passages normally referenced, which I thought about putting on the handout and did not, is Plato. Plato talks about how the Athenians have chopped down all the trees. There's soil erosion or something like it. The mountains are bare. There's no more trees left. We've overextended, so on and so forth. And a lot of scholars have really attached onto that reference. And a lot of other scholars think it's not so great. Forbes is perhaps the other really important scholar, 1996. And he talks about how we need to rethink, again, what we're thinking about when we talk about this notion of deforestation. It's still kind of an up in the air question. I quite like the Alain Bresson point that surely there's not a whole lot of timber near Athens, but when we go further out, we would expect to see more. There's some really great work by this scholar Fichard, who also shows up in the bibliography. She's done this really cool work with roads and how roads were built up deep into the mountains to hopefully cut down on transportation costs to bring these logs back into Athens. She's done some work on Daukas, memory serves, and some really cool idea about borderlands theories. She has this idea about borderlands and lumberjacks and tree production. So it's a complicated but very fascinating take. I think that I kind of fall on Alain Bresson's point mostly because everything we see suggests that timber is very expensive. Every inscription, every reference to it, it always seems very expensive. The reference that I really wanted us to look at, but didn't have the time, was the Acarnanians. The moment when Dicaeopolis, he's being attacked by the Acarnanians. Character in play, he wants to make a personal truce with Sparta. This is during the Persian Wars. So it's supposed to be very funny. The Acarnanians don't like it, so they're throwing stuff at him. And he runs into his house and comes out with a basket of charcoal. And in my mind, it's a basket of charcoal, and he has a knife. And he's like, don't come any closer, or else I'm going to attack the charcoal. And they all say, no, no. And they go to the bottom, don't kill our portable charcoal. I think that's a reference to how valuable it is. I think that's actually that's so important that we don't want you to do anything to it because it's so valuable. Of course, we're talking about valuable when it comes to fuel. So perhaps it's not worth its weight in gold or something like that. But it's still so very valuable that I think it's Brisson too talks about how like we have lots of references of ancient people who, when they get cold, they go to a bath or some sort of a complex, and they go right up against the warm sides of the walls. That's how they warm up. If they have easy access to timber, they're going to be warming up at home, right? Instead of like running out and doing this. So it's a real interesting question, which I think does need to be thought about more carefully. But I don't know. There's a lot to read, I guess, is my point.
We've got an online question. Thanks so much for the talk, Dr. Daukas. On the topic of deforestation, I'm wondering if Athenians were concerned about deforestation for environmental reasons. Was the urgency to find other sources of wood was limited to economic and material needs, or if there was a sense of harm deforestation for ships could cause environmental harm?
Yeah, excellent question. So this is another big debate. The question of notions of environmentalism and whether or not the ancients had ideas. So old scholarship says maybe, but only for certain religious areas, sanctuaries. I think this is debunked. There's a great article, 2018, Italian scholar, I think, Gallo, Gallo. And he's one of the first people to kind of step out and say, actually, if you look very carefully at what's going on, they seem to have a really serious concern about maintaining forests. In fact, there's a certain, I can't remember the name of it, there's a certain type of profession that seems to be somebody who takes care of forests. So not somebody who chops down trees, but like a forest caretaker. This, I think, is Davis or Harris in the handout. But so it seems like there's a serious concern. There's definitely an economic concern. The ideological question of whether they were worried about the environment, I think, is a really difficult and complicated one, at least in part because surely there's some connection to religion, but they, of course, don't think of the environment like we do, right? I'm not an expert in this, but I do suggest that you take a look at the Gallo. What I would say to try and finish this point is they absolutely had a concern for the environment. They had concerns about, from an economics perspective, and perhaps in other perspectives too. Yes.
So I was wondering again on the topic of deforestation. You sort of mentioned that there was this local wood industry which ends up costing a lot of money because you need to transport lumber by land instead of by sea when you get the lumber to build the ship and then you use the leftover lumber as for other things instead of ships. So I'm wondering, how does this use of lumber impact the local lumber industry? Do we have any indications of how it impacts the local lumber industry that already exists? Could we say that there might be a reforestation happening in Athens, or do the efforts of maintaining local tree resources just decline because now you're getting all this lumber for your industrial needs from elsewhere, so you don't need to spend the time to replant your trees in your countryside anymore? And then, sorry for a long question, and then does this impact Athens as it loses access to these trees that it's conquered essentially? And now it's lost sort of or its local lumber industry has declined, and it's also lost access to these trees that it was importing because it conquered Eion.
Right. So this is a really interesting question. The basic point I have to say is there's just not enough evidence for me to give you a very satisfying answer. If we look at the studies that have been done about this, it seems like lumber never actually gets cheap. So if the question there is this impacting the local lumber industry, I would say it seems like there's such a high demand that it doesn't. That's kind of, but I can only like gesture in this direction, because I don't really know. I think that there are certain economic echelons that will allow local producers to do really well too. So the question is, okay, they have to transport this stuff over land, but they are still very close to Athens, right? So maybe they're still doing a good job of this, and they can sell their lumber a little bit more cheaply than any sort of lumber that's coming all the way down from Eion. And so in that case, it doesn't really affect them at all because there's just not enough to satisfy that demand. Maybe there's a huge glut of lumber. It's kind of really hard to tell. It's also really hard because, as I mentioned, there are different types of lumber for different needs. I mean, Russell Meggs makes a really good point in that, some of this lumber is so valuable that like no one would ever use it for like homes. So like this elate stuff, the price of this stuff is so high that you would like apparently never use it for your house, except the Theophrastus tells us that it's great and you should use it everywhere, right? So that's kind of a problem. I don't know how to resolve that. So I would say, I think we just never hit that demand. And I make this point about grain too. There are tons of grain producers in Athens. Athens never stops importing grain because it always needs grain. The demand there is clearly so high that local producers aren't particularly perturbed about this because they want to make sure that they can eat just like everybody else. So that, I think, is the better perspective to take, that the demand is so high that like it never gets to the point where people are sort of angry about it.
Another online question?
Do you know of any modern day parallels to an economy that was so dependent on trees/wood or other natural resources?
I mean, I adjusted to the oil economy, which I feel like that was a pretty decent a push. It's a bit tricky just because what's important here is the military application, first and foremost, right? We get this economy because they need that stuff coming in 24/7. Those shipments can't ever stop. So I don't know. I mean, I mentioned computer chips. I don't know much about the modern computer chip industry, but maybe that's kind of a very important point there. I'm an ancient historian. Can I say that? I'm an ancient historian. Did you have a question?
There actually is, I think, a pretty good parallel is in Bermuda in the 18th, 19th century. The Bermuda seizures that are now extinct because of the bug are almost extinct, but those were used for shipbuilding, and those became a huge asset, and then centered people stopped cultivating land and instead just grew.
Oh.
Grew these cedars, and they were, it's one of the earliest, like, that might be it. So, and I also had a question about maybe not between the deforestation, obviously this is, do you see any connection between potentially the replacement of maybe woodlands in the area of Athens? Like, do you see any connection between this phenomenon and maybe the intensification of olive production and oil production? Because those are such slow-growing trees, and they, the wood's great, but it's not, so it has its own limited resources. Now, obviously, an olive orchard, an olive grove is not going to be producing. A tree will die every few years, and they'll cut it down, and they'll put in another, but it's not. More land.
It's another timber producing.
Yeah, more land is being used for this other kind of.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the major points that a lot of people who are pro deforestation, so this is what's going on, this is what's happening, will say. They'll make reference to agriculture. So Hughes does this. He talks about, at any point in time, what we see is Athenians going out and they're trying to constantly acquire more and more land because they need grain, right? And if you have to pick between eating and firewood, you're probably going to pick eating if you have to. So land is constantly being cut down and cultivated. And if that just keeps happening over and over and over again, you're going to go slowly but surely lose more and more timber. Harris has suggested that actually it's not really quite like that, and that we actually see a lot more interaction between the forest, quote unquote forest, and agricultural land. There's lots of products and valuable resources that you can get out of forests. So he thinks that actually we're seeing a lot more interaction going on. There's also a very strange argument about goats, which comes up over and over again. And I think the idea is goats are very destructive. And so they, if you are pasturing this, that is to say, the goats will go and destroy more farmland, forest land. And then if it's destroyed, I might as well just grow grain on it, right? Several scholars have suggested that this is probably a problematic approach to take. And, you know, I mean, are you letting the goats do this? So there are several major pressures that scholars have identified. And there, you know, other scholar Forbes has pointed out, you know, there's lots of different ways that you can get timber out of trees that don't look like timber. So there's something called maquis, I believe it is pronounced, M-A-Q-U-I-S. This is like scrub stuff. He has some really great evidence to suggest that ancient peoples could get that stuff to grow and to be used as firewood, which is really surprising to me. But he suggests, and so this is connected to this notion that, you know, the Mediterranean wasn't ever a huge ancient primeval lush forested space. It's mostly lucky scrub grass stuff, and you can do a lot with just that. So yeah, it's kind of this back and forth, I'd say. Does olive production have something to do with it? Sure, I'm sure they cut down some trees to plant olives. But where's all the timber, where's all the charcoal coming from to feed the never-ending smelting mines at Lorien? I'm pretty sure there's at least some local resources that are being pulled all the time from there too, for that too. Yeah.
I think I was told as a student that in a trireme battle, after a ship was rammed, it wouldn't actually sink, because it is wood after all, and wood tends to float, that it would just go down in the water such that it couldn't be rowed effectively anymore.
Right.
But it raises the question whether that wood then is entirely lost, or could it be towed to the land, dried out, and some parts of it reused?
That's a really interesting question. To be frank, I can't think of any passages that I've seen that suggests there's like some sort of attempt at reclamation. It wouldn't be too out of the ordinary. I mean, the question, of course, is there, if the damage is really bad, then it may not matter, because what you really need are these nice, big, long, single planks. I'm not sure if plank or beams. If you break those beams, you could use that stuff, but I don't know what you necessarily use it for. Perhaps there are other areas in the triangle that you can stick some of that in. And to your point, we do have examples of passages where the beaks of ships show up at like the rostra, right? They're like trophies. So are they taking trophies and then reusing the rest? Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. It's totally plausible. Yeah.
And just to return back to something that you were already talking about, the Athenians, I guess I was told again as a student that they could grow barley well enough in Attica, but wheat not so successfully, so they had to import it. And for this reason, there were laws that prohibited the export of grain, particularly wheat, encouraged the export of olive oil and wine. But if what you're saying is true about the importance of wood, why isn't wood part of that picture?
Yeah. So this is a really interesting question. The person I've seen engage in this the most is Ben Aykroyd, 2019. He has this like it's a book on demography, demography in Athens. Really great. He actually asks this question over and over again, because if you just follow basic demographics, the Athenian people, especially in the 5th century, when the population explodes, right? They like desperately need wood. They desperately need wood all the time, just to do basic cooking. So a lot of scholars have made this point. Well, why don't we see a law that's trying to get us bring in more wood? And his essential point is, I can't square the two. I can do the demographics and I can tell you that all of this, but I can't tell you where this stuff is coming from. I'm always on the lookout for this. I wonder how much of this is just some of this stuff doesn't survive. But in the Acharnians, there is a reference right at the beginning. You can tell I've read the Acharnians recently. Right at the beginning, there's a reference about Decapolis is sitting there at what looks like an assembly. And there's a reference to, so we need to decide sometime today whether we're going to buy grain and charcoal. So that reference suggests that in the assembly, they were making decisions about buying grain or charcoal. Those are the two things that he talks about. And then he skips up because he's angry about the Persians, right? Or the Persian eye. So that to me says maybe there actually is something like this going on, and we just don't hear that much about it.
But I would know that Acharni is a center for charcoal manufacture.
Yes. Yeah. So there's also this question too, and this kind of goes back to the question about local producers. So is this who's buying this charcoal? Again, like there's no follow-up to this in the Acharnians. There's a really quick like, we should buy charcoal maybe, and then we move on, and as far as I know, we don't go back to it.
There is
Right. We have the threatening of the charcoal later. Yeah, it's a really interesting question to ask. I mean, what I want to say is, well, it's all coming from Eion. They're set. They've got timber coming in and out. So yeah, I don't know. It's a great question. Yeah.
There's one more question that I was thinking about other fuel sources and do we have any records of people using animal dung or basically cow pots or fuel? Because that often, in a situation where there's a lot of grazing and not a lot of trees, that often becomes the case.
Yes. Yeah. I'm thinking, like prairie central. I don't know much about that. I have not seen any references to that. There's a couple of really interesting articles that have been written by people who have pointed out that when you squeeze all of the olive oil out, you get like trash, residue, I'm not sure what you call it. And we absolutely have evidence that they took that stuff and they burned it. They absolutely did that. There's some recent scholars who have tried to say, oh, this is actually a really important part of the energy economy in Attica, because I mean they squeeze a lot of olives, right? A lot of people, Alambrasonos, others have looked at this and said there's just not enough. I'm sure they're doing this, but it's just not enough to cook to cook your meal every night. So that's why I said I gave you a number. 90% of fuel sources come from trees. The other 10%, at least half of that is these like olive pucks that they kind of like squeeze and they throw into the furnace. But there's just doesn't seem to be enough to.
They're using it for lamp oil too.
Right, absolutely.
Well, this has been. I had no idea that this would be such a fascinating talk. I'm really pleased, and your lively presentation was terrific too. So another round of applause, and then good.
Thank you.